Hello class and welcome to day 3. Today we're going to talk about physical growth and aging across the lifespan. Let me get this all set up here. And our pointer. So there we go. Okay, first thing we're going to talk about is REM sleep, REM sleep. That is a period of active sleep. Sometimes, although not always, closed eyes in infants, their eyes will move back and forth in a pattern as if they're watching a movie or something. This is considered active sleep, and it's similar, but it's not the same as rapid eye movement. This also can be found in older children and adults and is usually related to dreaming. REM sleep for an infant takes about half of their sleep time, compared with 20% of an adult sleep time. However, as they age, this becomes less and less. In about 6 months, it's just about a third of their sleep time is in REM sleep. Some researchers think that it's a way for the brain to stimulate itself. They call it auto-stimulation. It's a chance for the brain to keep active. And we're going to talk about brain development a little in a couple more slides. So here is a graph showing weight gain and height gain over development. So we have age and years along the bottom. We have boys and girls. You can see that pretty much as far as weight goes, they stay similar up until about 6 years old. Well, 4 and 6, boys tend to put on a little more weight than girls do. Not drastically different. Height, you'll see 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that boys tend to grow a little faster up until about 5 or 6 years old, and then the girls start to equal out, and you'll see in another slide that girls tend to be a little taller than boys for up until puberty. So in middle childhood, there's a lot of height changes, weight changes. Again, it's the only time on average that girls tend to be taller than boys. Now there are cultural changes as far as growth goes. So here we can see where poverty might have a play in development of weight and height. A child who does not have sufficient nutrition is not going to grow. They don't have the things needed to grow their body in weight or height. A disease can have an impact on height and weight. Genetic inheritance can have an impact on height and weight. And stress in a family can also have an impact. So imagine for a second a child who lives in poverty, which right by itself is a stressor. More chances of disease, less chances of nutritious food. You can see how a child in poverty may fall below the lines for height and weight. Then we have growth during adolescence. This is a rapid pace of physical and sexual maturity. Weight increases, skeleton body changes, and there's an asynchronous growth pattern. What that means is that certain body parts start to grow faster than other body parts. So this is where you get the gangly, long-legged, long-armed young ladies and young men of adolescence. Again, this can be impacted by genetics, stress, the same things we just talked about. Puberty begins earlier in girls than it does for boys. Girls typically start around 11 or 12, where boys begin around 13 or 14. This varies. There's a lot of speculation on hormones in milk, and does that make girls go into puberty earlier? There is a genetic link to when girls and boys hit puberty. It tends to match up pretty similarly with family traits. influenced again by nutrition, health, and environmental stressors. For boys, the penis and scrotum begin to grow at an accelerated rate around the age of 12 and reach adult size 3 or 4 years later. Begin to have an enlargement of the prostate gland and seminal vesicles, and they can create sperm around the age of 13. Please remember this and puberty for girls. When we talk about brain development, there's a certain phase where the frontal lobe, the part where we make good decisions, is not yet developed. Be sure to notice the age. So we kind of talked about this. How would genetics, environment, and culture or lifestyle influence infancy? A child who is unhealthy or not in an environment to have good food isn't going to have the best outcomes as far as development. Same with preschool, same with early childhood and adolescence. And we're going to talk about early adulthood, and then we'll not talk any further. Early adulthood is where we reach our peak at that point. Physical capabilities are at their highlight right there. Professional athletes are at their peak during early childhood. The brain reaches its maximum size and weight, but we still continue to prune and myelinate our brains. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Our senses are at their peak in early adulthood. Now we're going to talk about the nervous system. So this picture will show you neurons are the basic cells of the nervous system, and the nervous system is comprised of the brain and the nerves that go through the body. And we have the cell body. The dendrites reach out to communicate with other cells. The axon and terminal buttons and the myelin sheath. At birth, children are born with 100 to 200 billion neurons, but very few of them are connected. They have them, but they don't communicate yet. During the first 2 years of life, that's when all these connections are established. So again, think of a child who is not given stimulation, does not get to enjoy the world, does not have a lot of toys to play with. Those connections are going to be harder for that child to make. Babies are born with way more neurons than they need. Although we create synapses constantly, and by create I mean every time we learn something new, we tie in synapses, we tie in our neurons, our brain cells. So every new skill creates new synapses. Child develops 1 billion of them during their first 2 years, but most of them are not needed after that. So what happens is if a synapse is not used over time, it begins to disintegrate it and eliminate it. It's eliminated. That way, your brain is not going off. I think of it like a path. If you have a thought process and you come to multiple branches of a thought process, you don't want to go down the path that you don't need to go down. So your brain naturally gets rid of those paths that you haven't traveled in a really long time, which is why sometimes you've learned something and you have to go back and relearn it. Those pathways, those synapses that are used over and over again are then myelinated. That's an insulation. And what that does is it creates a speedier connection. So when we study, and we study the same thing over and over again, and we have to continually recall it, not just see it, learn it, and say it, but to recall it, that strengthens, that insulates that myelinization and makes it easier to recall later. So here's what that looks like. At birth, you see how they're not connected in here? But at 1 month, 3 months, 15 months, 24 months, you see how all these cells are starting to connect. And those connections make it quicker and easier for the child to recall and do the tasks that it had learned to do. So neurons also kind of reposition themselves as we grow and become different. The cerebral cortex is our upper layer of the brain. The subcortical levels regulate things like breathing and heart rate. So shaken baby syndrome, because babies' brains are so sensitive and they don't have those neurological connections yet, they're very, very prone to injury. This is why we have car seats, why we buckle our children into toys and swings and things like that. An injury, a brain injury to a baby, is devastating. So we talk about shaken baby syndrome. That is where somebody takes the baby and shakes it, usually due to frustration or crying. It causes the brain to rotate, which causes blood vessel tears and can lead to many, many issues. I met a baby once who had shaken baby syndrome. This poor little guy was 4 or 5 months old when he was shaken. I met him at 6 months old. He was completely blind. He had epilepsy. He could not be laid down flat. It was a terrible situation. This poor child will spend his entire life in care because will never be able to take care of himself. All because a parent got upset and shook him. Very, very sad thing. So there's environmental influences to our brain development. Every time we learn something, every time we're exposed to something, it causes our brain to have plasticity. What that means is that it allows our brain to continue to grow and develop. That's why it's really important that through life, we're continually challenging our brains. We're continually challenging children, adolescents, infants to think and learn new things. Because the more we do that, the more plasticity, the easier it is for them to learn. We talked about sensitive periods and what happens if the child is impacted during that time period. We had that graph yesterday about development in the womb. The same thing happens outside of the womb. If a child during that first 2 years does not receive stimulation and learning and the chance to develop, it's going to cause a slower impact later. Think maybe of a child whose parents were very quiet and did not talk to the infant. They may have slower speech or be behind in speech when it comes to school age. So brain lateralizations. We have two sides to our brain. We have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. Boys tend to have better language in the left hemisphere, whereas girls, their language is developed pretty equally between both the right and the left hemisphere. So there is a theory that that's why boys have a higher autism incidence, because autism seems to impact the left hemisphere the most. But the question is, do girls have an equally divided language thing between the two hemispheres because it's genetic, or is it because girls are encouraged to develop their verbal skills faster than boys? So that's my question for you. Do you think that girls have an evenly divided language thing between the two hemispheres because girls are talked to more as infants and small children, or do you think it might be genetic? And here's the question. So here's where we have brain growth, all right? Myelin increases. That's that sheath that covers the communication pathway. When myelin increases, it means that information is easier to get to. Excuse me. So we have up here occipital and parietal, I can't even say these words, lobes, and then the frontal and temporal lobes. Frontal and temporal lobe is where we have things like decision making, impulse control, time management, organization. All of that is right here in this green line. Okay, so we look at 1 to 5 years, pretty rapid growth in the area of frontal and temporal. We have a little spike right here, a little spike right here, and at about 16, well, we're going to talk about 13. So look at 13. No frontal and temporal lobe growth at that time period. So we talk about puberty hitting young ladies and young men at the ages of 11, 12, 13, 14. That's the time when their brains are the most underdeveloped as far as frontal and temporal lobe growth is. That's crazy. We look at 16, again, frontal and temporal lobe growth kind of drops off a little bit. This is when we put them in a car. A little scary to me. So we talked about that. The prefrontal cortex is part of our decision making, our impulse control. So if the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until the 20s, can law hold a teen accountable for murder? If the brain, the ability to control impulses and make wise decisions, is not developed until 20, how can law hold a teen accountable for things like murder? The brain produces an oversupply of gray matter during adolescence, which is later pruned at a 1 to 2% per year. So during adolescence, there's a lot of brain growth, not necessarily in that frontal lobe, but in the other areas, and then it starts to prune back again. Myelination increases and continues to make transmission of neural messages more efficient, meaning learning is another good spot for learning. Now we're going to talk about reflexes, protective reactions to things. All babies are born with reflexes. Every single child is born with reflexes. So some of them are the sucking reflex, swallowing reflex, rooting reflex, which is looking for food, coughing, sneezing, and blinking. And here's when these things start to come out. The rooting reflex comes out at 3 weeks, and that is being able to know that if something touches your cheek, you turn toward it, and that tends to be food. The stepping reflex at 2 months, movement of legs when held upright with feet touching the ground. Swimming reflex, 4 to 6 months. Infant's tendency to paddle and kick in a swimming motion when laying down in water. And these are the reasons they think these things are occurring at that time. And the Moro reflex at 6 months is activated when the neck and head support is suddenly removed. The arms of the infant are thrust outward like they're trying to grab something. Now in your book, and I don't have it on the slide, there is a community, a cultural community where their children do not have the Moro reflex. And I think the book goes on to explain why they think that is. So please be sure to check that. Babinski reflex, 8 to 12 months. An infant will fan out its toes if you stroke the bottom of its foot. Startle reflex happens throughout. Any noises, they fling their arms out and arch their back and spread their fingers. Eye blink reflex, rapid shutting and opening of eyes and exposure to light. Sucking reflex continues. Gag reflex. So these are all things that every child has. Except for we have some differences as far as when those reflexes come out. I gave you ages, but in certain cultures, it's a little bit different. Those reflexes are genetically determined and they're universal, except for the Moro reflex. For some reason, like I said, there's a community, a culture that doesn't have that. So why do we need to know about reflexes? Well, this is a measurement that universally every child has. So it's used as a diagnostic tool. You'll see if ever went to a doctor's appointment with an infant, you'll see the doctor testing those reflexes just to see if the child is at the age they're supposed to be. And here's some milestones of motor development. Again, this is a measurement for doctors. If at 12.3 months your child is not walking well, the doctor will begin to look at development. Is what's causing this delay, and is there something they can do to help the child catch up? Gross motor skills are skills that gross motor just means your whole body, like larger movements. Fine motor are things with your hands and your fingers and your little toes. Gross motor is big stuff like climbing, jumping, running. So age 3, a child can walk upstairs alternating feet. They're not really able to stop or turn. They can jump a little bit. By age 4, they can walk down a long staircase alternating feet, but they need some assistance. Age 5, they're able to walk up and down the stairs alternating feet. They can stop, start, and turn. So you can see the difference in just 2 years. That's gross motor development. Again, if a child is not meeting their gross motor development skills, then they will probably be referred for physical therapy. Again, fine motor skills involve the smaller body parts like your fingers and toes. They require a lot of practice, and there's also a developmental pattern for that. This is why parents give their children little things to manipulate and pick up. You'll notice when children are tiny, they have large blocks to hold on to. One, because small ones are a choking hazard, but also because their hands are not ready to pick up little tiny Legos. As they grow and develop and are able to control their fine motor skills, the toys become more detailed, smaller pieces, more fine motor. Visual perception in infancies, a newborn's distance ranges from 2200 to 2600. By 6 months, they're at 2020. Their visual abilities begin to grow pretty rapidly. So when you see the baby kind of looking around, they can see, but they can only see the parent up close. It's important to note that children prefer certain kinds of stimulation, and they think that this is a genetically pre-programmed thing. Most children prefer to look at patterns versus simpler stimuli. So this would not be the favorite. Something like this or this might be the favorite. When I was raising children, all of the toys were very colorful but very simple. I notice now that like mobiles and toys and things are much more intricate. So auditory perception is the ability not just to hear, that's one part of hearing, but it's also the brain being able to understand and put to use the information that it's hearing. So infants have good auditory perception after they're born. They're very sensitive to certain frequencies. It is believed that a higher level frequency, like the tone of a mom, tends to be more comforting to a baby. They reach adult accuracy by age 1, meaning that in sound location, meaning that they can pretty much target in on where the sound is coming from by age 1. They learn to discriminate groups of different sounds. They can react to changes in musical keys and rhythms. They can discriminate many languages. Born with preference for particular sound combinations, which is probably, again, due to exposure to mom's voice in utero. Smell and taste in an infant. Smell is well developed at birth. It helps them to recognize their mom. It is usually, well, I said that. All right, taste. Infants have an innate sweet tooth. They would prefer a sweet taste over any other, and they can show facial disgust at bitter tastes. You can see this when we go to start feeding children, teaching them to have table foods. We always tend to start with the fruits, which are sweet. Then when you introduce something like peas, it doesn't usually go over very well. They also believe that a baby's preferences are based on what the mom ate during pregnancy. That means one of my children should love hot dogs. Sensitivity to pain. It is known that infants are born with the ability to experience pain. But they do develop as far as their reaction to pain. Exposure to pain in infancy may lead to permanent rewiring of the nervous system, resulting in greater sensitivity to pain during adulthood. That means if your child had a bad fall, was in a car accident, had to have a surgery as an infant, it could cause them to be more sensitive as they grow older. Those synapses, again, we talk about brain development, those synapses to that pain have strengthened. Touch is one of the most highly developed sensory systems in a newborn. Even the youngest infant responds to gentle touch. Several of the basic reflexes present at birth require touch sensitivity to operate. We talked about that. Tickle a baby's foot to see if those reflexes are there. Excuse me. This slide doesn't really go into great depth on the importance of touch. It is so important for an infant, a toddler, a young child, basically up until a child won't tolerate it. It is so important for children to be touched, to have a soft touch, to be, pet, massaged, whatever. It's very important for their development. So now in school years, we talk about visual issues. Visual acuity of less than 20/200 after correction is blindness. So that means even if somebody has glasses after correction with glasses, it's still 20/200. That is blindness. Partial sightedness is visual acuity of less than 20/70 after correction. So people who wear glasses tend to be in this one. Most visual issues are detected early, but every once in a while one does not come through or develops later in life. Auditory difficulties in the school years. I had an experience with this. My youngest son, we just thought he was being a little bit of a brat, but he kept tipping over and scraping off half of his face, and we thought he wasn't listening very well, and in reality he had some damage to his ears. So it's really important, those school screenings where they check for hearing, those are incredibly important. So loss of hearing affects 1 to 2% of school-age children. It varies across dimensions. And what happens if a child is not able to hear clearly while learning language is going to cause speech impairments. They are not going to give back the speech. They're going to give back the speech that they're hearing, which is not accurate speech. So it's very important to be up on all auditory checks. For my son, what happened is he ended up with an auditory disability, meaning that his brain, he can hear perfectly now. He could hear perfectly from 2nd grade on, but his brain can't recognize what he's hearing, and too much stimulation, too much noise around him causes him to have a very hard time picking up what he needs to hear. He can't pull the important stuff out of the other noises. Speech difficulties. Of course, it interferes with communication. Child onset fluency disorder is, we normally call that stuttering. It's a common thing. There are many different causes for it. It can be genetic. It can be a stress reaction. There's many reasons for it. And the level of impairment for speech difficulty can range from mild to severe. Again, let's talk about poverty. If you have a child living in poverty who is not exposed to clear, proper English, is not provided with that ability to hear it on a regular basis, it could lead to what looks like an impairment, but doesn't necessarily mean it's an impairment. It's just a lack of exposure. And it looks like that's it. So for today, you get one video and one question.